Madam Speaker, I rise to introduce the Roads Amendment Wildlife Impacts Bill, and I first want to acknowledge the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation. In particular, I want to acknowledge their over 60,000 years of custodianship of our wild places and their management of all things to do with our own survival. As a species in general are not doing well, and that includes humans. But the balance is absolutely skewed towards extinction of our wildlife, of our biodiversity, and I'll be talking about that a lot. But I'd also like to acknowledge in the chamber with me today the member for Newtown, Jenny Leong, and also the member for Balmain, Kobe Shetty. Madam Speaker, when the authors that wrote the Limits to Growth report in 1972 talked about the tension between the exponential growth of capitalism and population and the desire for things, material, and the finite resources of the planet, we have seen in those simulations that were done in the 70s, all of it come to bear and much, much worse. We are told that we need 3 planets to sustain where we are now. And unfortunately, what we know is that the trifecta of a warming planet and rampant economic and population growth means that our wildlife are facing extinction. This bill is something practical. It is something that the government can immediately, it's a lens through which roads, which we all rely on, unfortunately, but it means that when projecting into the future and future development, which is going gangbusters at the moment, that wildlife is taken into consideration. Because of course we know that an estimated 10 million plus animals die on Australian roads every year. I'd also like to give a shout out to Talia in my office, who's done all of this research, and our stakeholders who I will talk about, and also my research officer Audrey, who's here today. This bill, which amends the Road Act 1993, will require Transport for New South Wales to recognise and consider the impact of motor vehicle strikes on wildlife when making decisions about new roads and in reviewing speed zones. And Madam Speaker, what the community members and environmentalists that brought this to my attention in the first place was I've been very involved in my local traffic committee, as most MPs are, and it was mind-boggling to me that in speed zone reviews, you don't have to take into account the loss of wildlife. So in particular koalas, which we know are projected to be extinct by 2030, the idea that you can't include that in speed zone reviews, or indeed that there's no actual requirement to look at the impact on wildlife and biodiversity when building new roads or upgrading roads, is very shocking. And it's very shocking to my community, and I'm sure it's shocking to many people across the state. As I say, the 10 million plus animals dying on the roads have become the biggest killer. And this number is likely not the full picture, the 10 million plus a year, as the majority of car and fatal wildlife interactions are not usually reported. These numbers reflect a crisis that we have an opportunity to act on now. In deadly combination with rampant habitat loss and a warming planet, roads are directly aiding and abetting species extinction. And coming back to limits to growth, we seem unable to comprehend where we are going, and we seem unable to understand that we're going to be responsible for the extinction of species that our children and grandchildren will never forgive us for. And we have the opportunity to do something about it. It's just not where it is no longer good enough to just let rampant growth wipe out species, including ourselves. The NRMA's, now they are not a left-wing think tank. The NRMA's 2024 Wildlife Road Safety Report stated that beyond vehicle damage, the societal costs, so this is on top of environmental impacts, the societal costs of road trauma because of animal collisions are approximately $7 billion a year. So we're leaving aside the fact that people people who have very little education, in my view, about how to drive safely in terms of navigating wildlife, particularly in an area like mine. But so they are having accidents. Basically, they're having accidents, and not only are wildlife causing that on our roads, but also and being hurt and injured and killed, but also humans are interacting in a way that is costing the taxpayer $7 billion a year. Well, it's insurance companies are making a fortune, but it's costing residents of this state $7 billion per year estimated. We simply can't afford to remain in denial about this complex interplay and battle, if you like, between development, progress, and the protection of species, and that is within the context of an extinction crisis. And of course, Madam Speaker, at the moment we get called the extreme Greens, but honestly, who speaks for nature? No one has standing to speak for nature. And that is this bill will require the Transport for New South Wales has to speak for nature. It's no good having motherhood statements around that. It needs to be in law. To date, there has never been New South Wales legislation that refers to the protection of wildlife from road strikes. Staggering. Transport for New South Wales states that it has a statutory responsibility under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979, under the State Act, and under the Commonwealth Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, henceforth EPBC Act. They have a responsibility, they say, to consider the impacts of its activities on the environment, but this obligation is not measured by any government processes, and there is no consequence for failing to protect wildlife from road strikes. And as with most things we've seen with biodiversity offsets, honestly, it just goes off into the never land, and then it's people, amazing people in communities across Newtown, Balmain, my electorate, and all across the state that are paying attention and seeing that unfortunately it's a set and forget, and then including mitigation strategies, spending millions sometimes on optics, saying that yes, we're doing so much to protect the wildlife, and that mitigation doesn't work. Environmentalists say it won't work, ecologists say it won't work, but it still goes ahead, and then we're meant to all forget about it. Any mitigation efforts, effective or not, at protecting wildlife on our roads appear to be seen as satisfying the responsibility under both acts. Now let's just think of the logic of that. It means you could do anything and it satisfies the responsibility. Well, that's a joke. That's a joke. We need this needs to be compelled. The Transport for New South Wales and the Minister need to be compelled and answerable in the Land Environment Court or in other forums, answerable when this simply doesn't happen. The other part, Madam Speaker, is that there's absolutely no data, there's no detailed systemic data kept on the number of wildlife strikes on our roads, or about the species killed or injured. That's important data. When speed reviews in New South Wales are undertaken, as we know, and as it should, accidents involving people are considered, and no one's suggesting otherwise. We need to be looking at the impacts on people. I would like to see, and I know that my colleagues would like to see, pedestrian first principles everywhere. And it was interesting, my brother was just here from Seattle for my daughter's wedding, and in Seattle, which is a pedestrian first state in the US, you start putting a foot out on the road, cars have to stop. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to see the balance tip the other way. But of course, I also understand in regional New South Wales, where we have no public transport, that people are heavily reliant on their cars and our country roads. This strikes a balance in that it is not suddenly overnight banning cars. It's not suddenly overnight demonising drivers, but it is saying that the government has a responsibility. It can't talk the talk around protecting species, but in the actual practicality, do nothing to truly mitigate and to truly protect wildlife from road strikes. Madam Speaker, I'll just turn to some of the detail of the bill. There's not a lot. It's a very simple amendment. The object of this bill is to amend the Roads Act to provide for an additional object of the Act, that impacts on wildlife be considered, including that the impact of motor vehicle strikes on wildlife be taken into consideration when making decisions about roads and for related purposes. This would also allow all of us, all the MPs here on our local traffic committees, and police and stakeholders, including the reps from Transport for New South Wales, to have a conversation about the impacts on wildlife. I believe that everyone here wants to protect wildlife, but often just don't know how to. This at the design phase of building new roads, at the phase of upgrading new roads, after the impact of climate-fueled disasters, in the betterment language, these are the opportunities, and particularly when we're reviewing speed zones. Now, I also understand I like driving as fast as the next person. No one really wants that. But when we see those koala signs, when we are told to slow down because of wildlife, we do. Australians do care. They just need to be educated. They just need to have the guidance and the leadership from government. Madam Speaker, Schedule 1 inserts a proposed Section 3.1 into the Act to give effect to the object, as I mentioned. Schedule 1.2 inserts a proposed Section 261AA into the Act to require Transport for New South Wales, when exercising a function under the Act about a road, to consider the impact of motor vehicle strikes on wildlife. Without limiting that obligation, Transport for New South Wales must consider wildlife strikes when reviewing speed zones, and more broadly take actions to mitigate the impact of motor vehicle strikes on wildlife on all new roads, including by use of A, speed limit reductions, and B, works, including fauna underpasses, fauna overpasses, fencing and virtual fencing. And Madam Speaker, I will talk more about the colossal amount of taxpayers' dollars that is spent on so-called wildlife mitigation around roads that simply does not work. And that is something that Transport for New South Wales, under this Act, would have the mandate to measure the impact. Madam Speaker, the Greens are introducing this bill because we would like to see the impacts on our roadways on native wildlife improve to a point where rather than occurring on a daily basis, vehicle strikes of wildlife are an anomaly. And that is what the extinction crisis requires. And the more I read about the adaptation measures that we need to make, we need to do both things. We need to radically phase out fossil fuels, we need to radically roll out the renewables boom and lower our emissions, but we also have to have radical adaptation projects. And part and parcel of that is making tough decisions about how we protect vulnerable species and our native wildlife. One thing is certain: we cannot take the necessary steps to truly protect and conserve our wildlife, particularly our endangered species, when there's no requirement for Transport for New South Wales to keep data about the number and types of wildlife impacted, and while there is no mechanism for local government or community members to make the case for protection of wildlife on our roads. There's also no way to stave off extinction of wildlife on our roads when there's no consequence. There's no consequence. And that, as a member of the Greens, I got involved in politics because of the environment, plain and simple, and of course social justice issues. But the idea that we just turn a blind eye to the impacts of roads on our wildlife, it's heartbreaking. And I will be giving a shout out to all of those incredible the wildlife hospitals in my area, the wildlife vets, the wildlife carers, all of the people who are just slowly but surely seeing more and more of our endangered species dead on the roads. And when you see a koala dead on the road, it's hard to not remember that. And you show any child, you say to any young person that that's what we're about to see in this state by 2030, they won't believe you. They can't believe that you would let that happen. And that's because they're gorgeous and fuzzy and cute, but of course there's so many other species that are on the edge. While this amendment does not provide a mechanism for penalising Transport for New South Wales, it does, for failure to protect, it does strengthen its obligation under the law, and potentially matters could be brought, as I say, to the Land Environment Court when failures have occurred. Madam Speaker, can I just check? Can I get a time check, please?
You certainly can. This debate will expire at 10:39.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the Greens are bringing this bill to the House because our wildlife carers, as I say, our wildlife vets and our frontline conservation organisations are telling us that our roads are the biggest killers. So I believe them. Apart from a vague responsibility, the law is silent on the impacts of our roads, and nobody has the power over state roads or has the eyes across the magnitude or frequency. If we were able to have that view, that holistic view, I think we would all be truly and deeply shocked. We see it in spots, and then we go on with our normal business. It's true that Transport for New South Wales must consider wildlife, but the piece of the puzzle that is missing is that there's no specific legislative requirement for Transport for New South Wales to recognise this and to do something about it. Madam Speaker, there's approximately 180,000 kilometres of public roads in New South Wales. However, we don't know anything about the statistics of wildlife strikes. How can Transport for New South Wales effectively consider wildlife without access to those facts? The Department of Planning, Industry and Environment released a koala vehicle strike fact sheet number 4 last year, stating, and I quote, "Monitoring can be costly and emphasis should be on mitigation structures for which we actually have, for which we have little data." That's in the Department of Planning's own document, that it's costly and emphasis should be on mitigation structures that they have some data on. This statement highlights the need for more data. Surely evidence-based is the antidote. How can consideration be effective if it's based on estimates, or rather guesstimates? It's time for the impact of motor vehicle strikes to be counted. Koalas as a vulnerable species have been at the heart of government strategies aimed at reducing road impacts, and we commend those. But despite these efforts, we know that their numbers continue to decline and vehicle strikes remain the key factor in their extinction by 2030. And that I was speaking to conservationists this week, and like with climate change, which is defying all of the statistics, they fear that this is what's happening to koalas. And we cannot hurry the government along fast enough to do what they need to do to protect koalas in this state and end native logging once and for all. In the decade between 1992, when koalas were listed as vulnerable, and 2022, when koalas were listed as endangered, we've seen the release and update of the New South Wales Koala Strategy. The Northern Rivers Regional Koala Conservation Strategy states, and I quote, "For riverine and coastal areas, the management of disease, injury and vehicle hotspot strikes provide the most effective slowing of population decline." It's not rocket science. The role that roadways play in wildlife mortality is an issue that unfortunately has not received the level of attention it deserves. It is my hope that these amendments ensure that vehicle strikes are thoroughly considered by Transport for New South Wales in all actions relating to roadways moving forward. It's equally important that due consideration will be given to addressing the failures of...
Sorry, member.
Yes.